Hi everyone, welcome to our 2 Samuel chapter 16 Bible study. There's a lot to cover today, so just so you know, the free PDF is available on our website and there's a link down in the description. When did these events occur? When did 2 Samuel 16 take place? Well, we're talking about the reign of David, which lasted from about 1055 BC to 1015 BC. We've got a bunch of characters in this chapter too. David, who was the second king over all Israel and Judah. Absalom, who was David's son, who started a rebellion and tried to take the throne in the last chapter. That's the story that we're picking up on. Ahithophel, he was one of David's counselors, and the Bible says that he gave really good advice. Chapter 16, verse 23. Hushai, this was a friend of David's who remained in Jerusalem to spy on Absalom and to mislead him. Mephibosheth, we talked about him a couple chapters ago. He was the son of Jonathan. He was a lame man who David cared for. He ate at David's table. David had shown him kindness because he was Jonathan's son, and Jonathan was David's best friend. Then we have Ziba. Ziba was the servant of Mephibosheth that David had put in charge of Mephibosheth's land. He was charged with cultivating Mephibosheth's property. And then finally, Shimei, a relative of Saul who cursed David as he was fleeing from Jerusalem. Now up to our map. David, remember, is fleeing from Absalom. He fled with all of his household from Jerusalem across the Kidron Brook over the Mount of Olives. His party stopped at the Jordan River to wait for more information from David's informants inside Jerusalem. All right, our outline section. Got three sections. The first one's verses 1 through 4. It's a continuation of this narrative of David and his household fleeing from Jerusalem. So when David had passed over the Mount of Olives, Ziba, who, remember, he was the servant of Mephibosheth, he met David with donkeys that were laden with provisions for David's party. David asked Ziba where Mephibosheth was, because Mephibosheth was kind of under his care, and Ziba told him that Mephibosheth had elected to stay behind in Jerusalem because he kind of hoped that the throne that had once belonged to his grandfather would return to him. So Ziba says that Mephibosheth has kind of betrayed David. David had shown him kindness, and now Mephibosheth is like, maybe I'll get a piece of David's throne. Well, David believed Ziba, and he gave him all of the lands that belonged to Mephibosheth for this apparent betrayal. However, there's more to the story that we're going to talk about in later chapter. Section number 2, verses 5 through 14, Shmi curses David. So as David's company was moving on, they encountered a relative of King Saul's. His name was Shmi. Shmi mocked David, and he threw stones at the people in his party, and he cursed David, saying that David was a man of blood who deserved to be run out of Jerusalem for what he had done to the household of Saul. Now, Abishai, who was one of David's mighty men who was with David, he was actually the brother of Joab, if you remember, he asked David for permission to kill Shmi, but David refused to retaliate against him because he suspected that maybe the Lord had told Shmi to curse him. David's company then continued down the road until they got to the Jordan River, and Shmi followed them, continuing his rock throwing and cursing for a time. All right, that takes us to our last section, verses 15 through 23. Absalom sets himself up as king in Jerusalem. So Absalom and all of his allies came from Hebron, and they entered the royal city of Jerusalem. Hushai, remember David's inside man, his spy, his friend, he met Absalom, and he convinced Absalom that he was actually on his side. And Absalom believed him, so Hushai was a pretty good spy. Absalom then went to Ahithophel. Ahithophel is the guy who gave really wise counsel. And he asked Ahithophel, okay, now what should I do to establish myself as king? And Ahithophel told him that he needed to make his claim to the throne clear and cut off any kind of reconciliation with his father by sleeping with his father's concubines that remained in Jerusalem. And he was not just supposed to do this in private, but he was supposed to do it, quote, in the sight of all Israel. So there wouldn't be any mistake about what was happening. Absalom considered this to be pretty good advice, and so his servants pitched a tent for him on the roof, and Absalom had relations with David's concubines. And so, yet again, Absalom is up to no good in 2 Samuel chapter 16. Now let's finish off with our application. David knew that Ahithophel was a really wise man, and that's why he sent Hushai back to Jerusalem to thwart his counsel. Absalom had a lot of faults, but one thing that he did get right is that he knew the value of having wise advisors and seeking advice. He didn't just assume that he knew best how to proceed with the situation. And the Bible actually speaks very positively of this characteristic in a person, someone who surrounds themselves with good counselors. Proverbs 15 verse 22 says this, "Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed." In Proverbs 12:15, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice."